Hello everyone, this is a video all about ethical naturalism, which is a theory related to the foundations of morality, which happens to be the topic that we are looking at in Year 11 philosophy right now. And I've just skipped through a couple of slides, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to explain them now anyway. So the point of this particular video is to help you understand what ethical naturalism means. That's kind of the first layer in the onion, so to speak, when we're dealing with learning about a particular ethical theory and then digging a little bit deeper to applying that theory to a problem and also evaluating it. So once I've gone through the understanding part, in other words, through unpacking what this theory is all about, your job will be to see how it might apply to the ethical debate that you're looking at. And then finally, you need to evaluate the theory to figure out whether it is a decent theory to apply to your moral debate. And you might consider if others might use this particular theory and how you might be able to critique them through looking at the strengths and weaknesses of this particular theory and how it applies to a situation. So first of all, what is ethical naturalism? I've stolen this quote from Wikipedia because I think it helps sum up the core of this ethical theory. The quote says, "Inquiry into the natural world can increase our moral knowledge in just the same way it increases our scientific knowledge." So if you picture that scene there and imagine that a scientist went to that place and let's just say they wanted to test the pH level of the soil. They might use some special equipment and they might take some tests and record the results of those tests, and then they would have some objective data to draw some conclusions from about the soil sample in that particular place. In just the same way, ethical naturalists think that you can use observations and data, and also the whole concept of what's natural versus unnatural in the world to help us determine whether something is right or wrong. So in other words, science aims to tell us the facts about the world, and ethical naturalists think that there are moral facts that exist and science can reveal them to us, as opposed to something like a religious text or spiritual guide or leader or a god. So how do scientists get these moral facts? Well, basically, as a starting point, they think about the psychological and the physical consequences of a particular action to determine whether or not they should do that action. So as a little example, I have a couple of examples in this presentation to help show you what that might look like. First of all, murder. So murder is a pretty straightforward issue. Generally, most people think that murder is wrong. But if I approach it from an ethical naturalism point of view, I've got on the left a table that contains a couple of dot points about the negative psychological impacts that might be realized if somebody was murdered. And then on the right, I have some of the negative physical impacts that might occur if somebody was murdered. So an ethical naturalist would record these negative psychological and physical impacts, and that would be a part of the process of figuring out if something was right or wrong to do. As another example, I've got some data about domestic violence. So as you can see on the right, this is about the emotional consequences of spousal violence, and it's organized by gender. So the red bars are female victims and the blue bars are male victims. And this is all based on some research that occurred in Canada. So if you have a look down the left-hand side, you have some consequences such as the victims feeling upset, confused, frustrated, feeling angry, fearful, getting depressed and anxious, feeling hurt and disappointed, having lowered self-esteem, experiencing shock and belief, having sleeping problems, which is also a physical issue. They felt victimized, and the list goes on there. So that is an example of how research has been conducted into the issue of spousal violence in a particular year in Canada. And that data can help us see the negative emotional consequences of spousal violence. And therefore, an ethical naturalist could use that data to help support the claim that it is wrong for there to be violence within the home. So a strength of ethical naturalism is that using it to decide what is good and bad is based on measurable data, just like I showed you in the previous slide, and therefore you avoid having to believe in some kind of spiritual being, and you are just looking at the facts of the matter. Secondly, science already has a lot of authority in our 21st century world, so it makes sense to listen to scientific reasoning when it comes to moral dilemmas. And some would say that science has greater authority than something like religion, which used to have much more authority in our world, and it really did guide moral decision making, particularly, around 100 years ago and before that. But a lot has changed, and science already has a lot of authority now, so why not give it the authority in the realm of decision making about right or wrong? Okay, so, there are some weaknesses to ethical naturalism, as good as it sounds, and here's the first one. The first weakness is that science and data may be able to tell us what is the right or the wrong thing to do, but it can't tell us exactly why something is wrong. So if we look back at the example of murder, the data or the science can tell us what the physical and the psychological impacts of murder are, but that's just all they are. They're just observations. And these observations don't tell us exactly why it is wrong to murder. And if you take the leap from looking at the facts to making a claim about what you should or shouldn't do, this is called the fallacy or the problem of deriving ought from is. It's also referred to as the ought-is gap, and there is a video available about that on my YouTube channel, which is, there's a little picture of that there on the right. So a way to respond to the is-ought problem, which I suggest you watch the video about maybe before going any further. One way that you could respond, as is highlighted in italics at the top, is that the terrible psychological and physical consequences of murder are the thing that makes it wrong in the first place. So you've got this data about the negative psychological and physical impacts of murder, and those impacts in and of itself are what makes it wrong. So, but again, these observations of the negative consequences, they don't necessitate or entail that murder is wrong. They just are observations in and of itself, and they have no value attached to them. They're just data. And David Hume talks about this if you want to do a little further research on the is-ought gap. A way that you can respond to the is-ought gap or the is-ought problem is to appeal to general moral principles. So there are lots of general moral principles, and you may remember we looked at these. The whole concept of them is that a general moral principle or rule can be applied to any situation or to a number of different situations. So one general moral rule that you may think is quite a good one is that whatever helps mankind to progress, prosper, and live in harmony, that's a good thing. If we look at murder and we have to decide whether murder is a good or bad thing, we might question, does it help mankind to progress? Does it help mankind to prosper? And does it help mankind to live in harmony? Well, if it doesn't do those things, then you might consider it to be a bad thing because it doesn't fit into the criteria of what is good. So this kind of reasoning would mean any behavior or any action that breaks with the general moral principle or rule is a wrong thing to do. And things that do progress, prosper, and help human beings live in harmony might be considered the right thing to do. Similarly, you could you could approach the is-ought problem from an evolutionary perspective. So for example, whatever has allowed us to evolve and prosper in the past is good, and whatever has stopped us from moving forward is wrong. But this brings us to yet another issue. So if we look at the top the top left there, we see that by going down this train of argument, we're basically saying that good equals harmony, or good equals prosperity, or it equals progress. But all of these terms can be defined in different ways depending on who you are and who you ask. There's not one solid definition. And therefore, there's no way to have a solid definition of good. You might then wonder, does that mean there is no such thing as good in a factual sense, or bad in a factual sense? I have another video that is in my playlist. There's a little picture, a little scene from it there. I really recommend that you watch that video, particularly the second half. It explains this open question argument really well. So this is another challenge for ethical naturalism. One last critique of ethical naturalism is that if we look at history, we can find some evidence that maybe this isn't the best moral theory to base your actions on, or to base your decision making on. For example, we have Oscar Wilde, famous author, pictured in the right there, and he was a homosexual. Now, historically, homosexuals did really not have it easy. In fact, not very long ago, it was considered illegal to be gay, and people that were discovered to be gay were often forced to take on medical treatments or other treatments to deal with this condition, because it was seen as unnatural. Additionally, women were seen as the people that should be bringing up children and in the home, while men should be out doing other kinds of more manly jobs, so to speak. And that was the natural way that things were. But in our modern world, we don't necessarily consider those things to be, we don't necessarily consider it to be unnatural for a woman to continue working and a man to stay home and take care of the children. Although, in saying that, a lot of people still do believe that homosexuality is unnatural, and so they may consider it wrong for those reasons. So that's interesting to bear in mind, how the whole consideration of what's natural versus unnatural is still relevant today. If you want to do some further research, here are 3 places that you can do that. Obviously, you can't click on them through watching this video, but if you access the file of this presentation on Sector, then you can click on those. If any of you find a video about ethical naturalism that you would like me to add to my YouTube channel, please let me know. I'm always open to that. And I really do suggest that if you're struggling to understand this topic, that you do a bit of further reading, because it will help you to understand it.